Hey, Holland, I was going to ask you a couple of questions really quick
Sure.
here, because what's interesting about genetic engineering at its base level isn't that, like, when you talk about your genes are what produces, the likelihood of your biology evolving one way or another. And there's, of course, like, there's nutrition supply, like you said, there's the atmosphere that you grow up in, there's things that you carry forward from previous biologies of your parents and everything else. But is it when you're talking about gene editing, isn't that like it's like adjusting the chassis of a car that can grow? Like, I mean, it's like, to me, it's like the fundamental foundation. So, like, how in the world would anybody know that if you adjust this gene, that these other factors like that I just named are not going to produce a result that you didn't intend to? Because the ecosystem around you upon which we are evolving real time is moving,
Yep.
right? Like, if you adjust the fundamental structure, like, that structure, yeah, how do you view that based on just what you know about genetic engineering?
Yeah, I think that's kind of why the FDA exists, there's so many rigorous things that they have to enforce, and sometimes it means it takes a long time before we see this. Now, does it mean innovation takes a lot longer? Sometimes, yeah. I think that's kind of why we don't see these things for a lot of years. I mean, does it hold back some scientific advancement? That's debatable, right? I mean, I think in some countries, in terms of, like, let's say regenerative medicine, they're very far advanced than us. Is it because they're smarter? I don't think so. I think it's just the regulatory kind of is slower to catch up, right? And so the regulatory, certain things that might have been practical in 1990 or 1980, which is where some of these rules are written, don't apply to a world 40 years later. So I think in terms of like gene editing, like there's probably technology out there that could literally clone an organ, right? We're just not really ready for it from a complication standpoint. I mean, I think we were barely ready for an mRNA vaccine, right? Because I think there's so many complications. Now, obviously, it helped a lot of people, right? But it also, we see, I think, with some athletes or people who are predisposed to having vaccine injury, those people are now, I think there's a pretty big study that came out with sort of some of the potential problems that arise from the COVID vaccine. So, was it a good treatment or bad? That's a risk assessment, right? Maybe it's more of a, did you have the following risk criteria to qualify for what we call a biological intervention? So I think with gene therapy, we're kind of at a point now, like, well, what can it even do? Right. And I think one of the hard parts about this is that we're entering a realm of medicine where it's a kind of a little bit of like have and have nots. The haves get to find out what's cool, and maybe they live longer or healthier. Or on the flip side, they get exposed to more risk, right? Because they're doing things that are maybe not necessarily fully studied. And then you have the have-nots who, I mean, that's very clear what happens. People who don't have access to medicine, people who are not having, full proper medical care, they're more sick, right? And so I think that's kind of where a large part of, I think, why people have explored sort of this whole functional medicine realm, because to some degree, functional medicine is you can do it rabbit ears on your own.